Welcome to Spin Sisters. I'm Mary LaHammer.
And I'm Tara Erickson. And today we have a very timely and very important guest with us today. We have clinical professor of law from the University of Minnesota, Professor Linus Chan. He is also the faculty director of the Detainee Rights Clinic at the University of Minnesota. He is an immigration attorney that focuses on removal defense for those detained by ICE. Welcome, Professor, and thank you so much for doing this.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Speaking of timely, let's talk about the work you're doing right now. Let's talk about the courtroom and the classroom and the work you are doing at this time.
Sure, yeah. So I teach a clinic within a law school, and that idea here is that students learn best by doing. And so we have several students who are second and third year law students who are licensed by the Supreme Court of Minnesota. And I give them cases for them to work on, and they have several clients that we are representing. We have clients that we are representing in federal court and in immigration court, and in all different sort of aspects of the different cases, including people who are afraid about being detained and those who have been released since detention, and yes, people who are currently detained by immigration and customs enforcement. I also work closely with an ecosystem of other immigration lawyers and also with those who care about these issues from a legislative advocacy perspective and also just from an organizational organizing aspect. So I am a bit busy these days, yes.
Yeah, that's what I wondered the context. You've been doing this for a while. Is it as chaotic and unprecedented and fearful? You mentioned people are afraid as others are depicting.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this type of work for over 20 years.
Okay.
Um, and I can honestly say there's been nothing like this.
Mhm.
I think other people have used trying to put into context what numbers look like on the ground, right? And when we say we have 2 to 3,000 officers and they are masked and they are decked out in military gear and they are driving around in unmarked vehicles and coming out and literally taking people or breaking down doors and grabbing people and arresting protesters and arresting observers. I can honestly say there's nothing in my lifetime and or my memory that can quite really capture what it feels like. The sheer number of people who, as mentioned, are afraid. I hate the idea, and this is important that I want to make sure I say this.
Mhm.
I hate the idea that we have started to say, oh, US citizens are also affected as a way to say, oh, if it wasn't affecting US citizens, then it wouldn't be as big of a deal.
Sure.
And, but I don't, but it is important to understand that even people who legally, right, under the law as it is written, should not be feeling as if they would be detained or even kicked out of the country are feeling that fear. And that fear is a deliberate tool that this administration is using. And so, as even though I hated the idea of trying to use US citizens as like this hallmark, what the point of it is that even under the law, people who would normally not need to worry about this type of these actions, they are worrying. And that includes lawful permanent residents, people with green cards. It includes
Mhm.
people with student visas. It includes people who have refugee status. It includes people who are quote unquote doing everything the right way, right?
Exactly.
That's the big, line in the sand that a lot of people have tried to draw, which is, oh, well, if you break the law, if you don't follow the rules, then you should expect consequences. Well, what we're seeing now is that doesn't that's not the line that is being drawn by this administration. It is simply whether or not they can exercise the power that they have and whether or not they can be held accountable for that power. And I think that's an important aspect of what's happening right now.
So, Professor, thank you for that. I think a lot of folks keep talking about what different parts of the Constitution um, is this administration not following when it comes to what is happening here in Minnesota with ICE. So we talk about the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizures. The First Amendment, it is the right of citizens to tape or record,
The right
obviously.
of the people. I want to be clear, the right of the people.
Right of the people.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
No, no, it's
Thank you.
okay.
No,
I
thank
just
you
want
for
to make sure
correcting.
that
Yes, thank you for correcting me on that. Absolutely. Fifth Amendment, due process. 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection. What I'm wondering is, could you kind of go through all of these articles that are not being followed and kind of, tell us how they are being broken right now?
Sure. There was actually a speech done by Representative Jamie Raskin, who was gained some fame because he was the lead prosecutor in the impeachment trial of Donald Trump the second time around. And he gave a list of how what has been happening seems to have hit all of the different of the Bill of Rights. So you mentioned the First Amendment. Yes, they have suppressed the ability to protest. But to be clear, earlier in 2025, in the spring of 25, they were also arresting people for exercising free speech, right? So people who wrote, like, as you know, the postdoctoral candidate Ozturk, as well as several Minnesota students here who had spoken out about certain issues, were in fact targeting, and so that's a violation of the First Amendment. The Second Amendment, well, you have Alex Preddy, who was in his right. He had a carry permit under the
Hmm.
Second Amendment,
Conceal and carry permit. Yes.
concealed carry permit, and he was killed, right? Uh, there was even an argument about the Third Amendment. This is an amendment that almost nobody knows about, and it's of course never actually had its day in court. But there was arguments that when ICE and other government agents were, you know, I think there was a question about whether they were, uh, you know, requiring themselves to be able to be housed in certain hotels and other areas in the Minnesota area. That would be the quartering of
Ordering. Wow.
soldiers. That would be the
Yeah.
Third Amendment. I think it's a bit of a stretch, but the point is that you could see how massive this whole operation is. Of course, the Fourth Amendment, the violation of warrants, the violation of entering homes without a warrant. Fifth Amendment, which is due process, which is something that I think many people are arguing is not being followed by this administration. Sixth Amendment is the right to counsel, right? And this is what's happening. People are being denied the ability to see their lawyers, whether citizens or not.
Are
In
you
the
seeing that firsthand? Has that happened
I mean,
firsthand?
I haven't seen it firsthand,
Okay.
but I know for sure, and there has been a lawsuit filed on this behalf where basically the people at the Whipple building were not allowing people access to their lawyers, which
Mhm.
would be a violation of the Sixth Amendment.
Okay.
Seventh Amendment, that's jury trials and civil fines. I've written an article which basically said that I think deportation should have juries, and these are not having juries. So maybe that you could make an argument that's a violation of that. I think most people would disagree that's the law, but that's the whole point we're talking about. This Eighth Amendment, which I think a lot of people think about as proportionality, which is a requirement of proportionality, and here I think this is a violation of the Eighth Amendment in many ways, even if you think that deportation is an allowable penalty. It is extremely disproportionate to what we're seeing now. And we would argue that a lot of what the administration is doing is actually punishing people. They're not supposed to. Immigration deportation is supposed to be civil, but the way they talk about it, the way they cast everyone as the worst of the worst, the
Mhm.
way that they try to shame people with perp walks and social media
And what
clearly
about in the
seems a way
state?
to
Is
punish.
that somehow disproportionate to the moving from Minnesota so quickly to Texas? Is that disproportionate as well,
Yeah, I mean,
geographically?
I think that's a harder argument to make
Okay.
about whether or not that's punishment, but I do certainly think there is an argument about due process, about like deliberately really isolating people and putting people away. I've always thought that even immigration detention has always really been on the line of whether a lot of that is in fact punishment. We house people in prison cells. They are exactly the same as the people who are serving criminal sentences. There is no difference. In fact, in many ways, talking to many of my clients who've spent time in both prisons and in immigration detention, they say the prison conditions are better. So the idea here is much of the detention process is certainly what I would argue would be punishment under the system. The Ninth and Tenth Amendment are, certainly the arguments from Keith Ellison in the lawsuit that was filed on behalf of Minnesota was an argument about the Tenth Amendment, which was that the federal government was not honoring the ability of the states to take care of the rights of the people, which can include things like proper policing, medicine from hospitals, schooling for children. All of these things are being impacted. Now, clearly, that's a novel argument, and it's something that's going to be debated in litigation. But you can tell that
But
even
didn't they
if,
lose that they lost that court case, correct?
well, they only
At least
lost
in the
what's called
short term,
a
right?
preliminary injunction. They
Yeah.
didn't
Okay.
lose the
Got
case.
it.
The case is
Thank you.
still ongoing.
Thank you
And
for
the
yeah.
and the judge made clear that these were novel claims and that she needed to take them seriously, but that she couldn't make the finding that the government, Minnesota, quote unquote, would have won. And that's because it's a brand new type of claim.
Sure.
I think the importance here is not technical, like whether the Third Amendment was actually violated or not. I think it's more important that you see the giant impacts and how they impact everybody's rights and the narrative force of what's going on. And narratively, what we see, what's happening here in Minnesota, is a giant imposition on people's rights and on people's ability to live. I think one of the saddest, most heartbreaking thing that I've had to witness is how all of us here in Minneapolis have had our lives changed.
Mhm.
It's very difficult to have a normal sort of, the fact that our children coming back from winter break are suddenly having to deal with either classmates being taken or school being canceled or having to worry about ICE officials taking parents who pick up their children.
And we should say statewide. I know, Professor, you said Minneapolis, but
Yeah,
this is definitely
that's
yes.
only where I'm living. I'm not.
Right,
Mhm.
right. But
It's,
yeah, we have large immigrant communities throughout the state, and definitely, especially in some of the agricultural communities where
St.
the
Cloud,
people who,
Wilmer,
pick and
Worthington.
process and work in our agricultural and food industries in particular that are dependent on immigrant populations.
Yeah, people healthcare industries,
Healthcare, yep.
people who are providing health are finding quite a few people who are unwilling to get treatment or help and worried about going, and this includes people who are pregnant or about to have babies and who, are not seeking the kind of medical attention because they're worried about getting detained. That makes all of us less healthy, right? Like if,
Mhm.
what we see is when people don't get medical treatment, that makes it more difficult for everyone. Children not going to school makes it worse for everybody.
Yeah, and we've had those industries come forward. I work in the state capitol press corps, my day job, and we've had the healthcare providers, we've had educational leaders all come forward and talk now because this is not short term now. This is long term. From your perspective, coming back to the law and the courtrooms, I wonder about the consequences. We're talking about multiple court decisions, multiple constitutional violations. The big question I have is what are the consequences though? What power does the court have against the violations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and there are quite a few people. When the chief judge of the District of Minnesota comes out with an extraordinary uh, order and opinion that lays out how this agency has violated over 100 court orders, where you see that
In 1
remark,
month, correct? I
yeah,
mean, I think
in
he
1 month.
said in 1 month, and that is more than most federal agencies have done since their existence.
Yeah, and then you see, of course, um, the extraordinary admission of a government attorney. This is an attorney that works for the government saying that they are unable to get their own client, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to comply with court orders or to provide her with information that's extraordinary, and it leads a lot of people to what some have called a constitutional crisis, because
Yep. That's
the
what I
only
wanted to
thing
ask. Are
Mhm.
the
we
only thing that the court has, and I just want to, if the largest and most egregious scar about the lack of accountability is that we have had several men kill people in broad daylight, witnessed and recorded. And now we know that they were still working. That not, there have been calls about investigations, but we have at least this, like, the idea that these men would still be working, that there is only now any talk about a real accountability or investigation. And the fact that we have to have state officials have to be ones in which they are trying to investigate and trying to hold people accountable with their hands tied behind their back, and that there is the idea that they need to negotiate, which is what's happening. They have to negotiate with the federal government in order to get cooperation on what is a crime, a murder. Um, that's extraordinary. And the
And
fact
we
that
should say the
the
federal
court had
government
to step
very
in.
much disputed that it was a crime and that it was necessary from their
But
perspective. Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
be clear. Can you imagine in any other scenario where a person did that and there wouldn't at least be a situation where there is an active investigation? It is. I
Right.
understand that
The Vice President of the United States,
everyone should have
his
a day in
attorney,
court. Everyone should have a
said
day,
there are no consequences, right? That has said over and over that federal agents are immune,
yeah,
that
which
there is
is
blanket immunity.
not quite accurate, but it is important, because we have over the years, and I'll just say this. So we have a law, which is a bunch of civil rights laws, that say that when state law enforcement officials violate people's constitutional rights, right, not only are they subject to criminal prosecution, but they would be subject to
Mhm.
civil rights damages, Section 1983, Section 19, and that's a very important aspect that came out of the Civil War. The idea that we need to hold law enforcement and other government officials accountable for violating people's civil rights. There is no corresponding statute to hold federal officials.
So there is a basis of law. The vice president is a lawyer. He does know what he's talking about, you're saying.
Well, it's not completely accurate, but
Okay.
it is, it's not nothing called full immunity. The only person apparently that the Supreme Court has given full immunity is the president. But there is in fact a lot very difficult to hold federal officials for violations of constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court has explicitly invited Congress to fix that gap,
Hmm.
and said, the court created a doctrine, which was a court-made doctrine called Bivens, which is supposed to mirror the civil rights case. But the Supreme Court has said, this is judge-made. It should really be Congress that does it. And I think that is what we're seeing. Is we're seeing an agency that says, you know what, we're not accountable. Maybe a court will find what we did is unlawful, but what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, then that person that we just unlawfully detained will have to get released. That's, I still need to meet my arrest quotas, so I don't care. Well, maybe if we can start holding them, at least, because we're not able to apparently hold them criminally responsible because of how difficult that could be. Well, maybe we should start holding them civilly responsible and see whether or not money damages could be something that the government will finally start listening to. That will take, either state law, which there has been some passages in California and Illinois on this, or Congress to finally close this gap, which has been a gap that not only is something that Republicans and Democrats alike, right? You can imagine during the era of Biden era, whether or not Republicans would have wanted to be able to sue federal government officials for violating their rights. Should be no excuse. Why
None.
should we
Yeah.
not hold people accountable for violating their rights? It's a weird gap that has been in place for a long time, and I think it's been long past that it should be closed because otherwise you have people acting with impunity.
Professor, can I ask you a question about habeas corpus?
Mhm.
So, obviously, it's one of the oldest civil liberties in Anglo American law. It exists specifically to prevent arbitrary detention, secret imprisonment, executive overreach, holding people without access to courts. So, I did not know this. I saw it yesterday that three Native American men are still missing. So they were taken before, I believe, Renee Good was shot and killed. They can't find them. Nobody's releasing their names. I think they're trying to protect them. Can we talk about habeas corpus a little bit? Explain that more, and how this specific law is being obviously not followed at all during this occupation.
Yeah, so habeas corpus, the best way to describe it is it is the vehicle in which all of our rights sort of get protected.
Okay.
It is, and it itself is also considered a right. It's called the Great Writ. It is what many people have described over the history of American constitutional law as the most important right. There are times in which the writ of habeas corpus, and it's written into the Constitution, and it's written into the Constitution specifically because it says the great writ, the right of habeas corpus, cannot be suspended, right? So it's then you can't prevent the great writ from being available, and then it says unless, right? And
Okay.
so one of the unless, right, is in the times of rebellion, right? So this was the last time that it was recognized as actually being suspended was during the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham
O-
Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War.
Okay.
Um,
For
there's
how
a,
long?
I don't know exactly for how long. I mean, the
Okay.
Civil War essentially was about 4.5
Or
years,
yeah.
but I don't think he suspended it early, and so I don't know exactly.
Okay. Okay.
So it is extremely important. It is the right to be able to force the government to quote unquote bring the body, physically bring the person to court to
Uh-huh.
allow a court to decide whether or not the person
That's
is
the
under
corpus part, right? That's the Latin root of corpus.
exactly
It's
bringing
really
the body,
yes,
corpus.
yeah, it's
And the idea, of course, as you so eloquently said, it is the method to prevent secret detention. It's the method to prevent the government from detaining people and not having the ability to be free, right? What we saw, just to give an example, I looked at this recently, and there's several websites people can look at. One is called Habeas Dockets. I use that, which tracks the number of immigration habeases that have been filed. In the week of December 1st, which was the week that Metro Surge started, there were 12 habeas petitions that were filed in the District of Minnesota, only in the District of Minnesota.
Okay.
In the week, just the week, which is 6 days actually, of I believe January 11th, between January 11th and January 16th, there were 106 habeas corpus petitions filed. I think someone had counted in the month of January, there was something like 600 habeas corpus petitions filed.
So these are people, I mean, we're seeing them enter homes without judicial warrants, ICE agents doing this. Obviously, we're getting a lot of images and, we're seeing people being brought out in 20 below weather and their boxers and slippers,
Mhm.
no clothes.
Yeah, and an
Um,
elderly Hmong man, yep, mhm,
yeah,
US citizen.
absolutely. Um, how is it that we can't find these three Native American men? And we talked to Governor Arnie Carlson recently, and he actually said a lot about what is happening right now. One of the things he said is the Nazis were evil, but they were competent. And he said, this is evil, but they're not competent. And I want your take on that, in the fact that we have systems, I'm assuming, set up where electronically somebody should be able to look up and track somebody. Is this about competency or literally just not caring about following the law? Do you think you can distinguish between those two things?
Here's what I will say. So we have seen the people I know personally, I've seen situations in which a person will get arrested by, let's say, 9 in the morning, and they are on a flight to El Paso in about 3.5 hours later.
Okay.
Then we get people telling the court, the federal district court judges, which is one of the things that the judges are getting frustrated at, telling them that they could not bring them back to Minnesota and could not release them, you know, more than a week or 2 weeks after they were ordered to do so. And of course, judges in their orders to release always give some amount of time to do it. They don't
Okay.
just say you have to release today or like this moment.
Sure.
So this would mean that there are
Is there
people
a
who,
standard for that? I'm sorry, Professor. Is there a standard? Like, do they generally say you have 48 hours to produce this person or, is there
yeah.
a standard?
No, I mean, I think in some cases they order immediate release or they order release within 3 days or whatnot, right? But there's always an understanding, certainly, that this is a logistical situation. But I think it's fair to say that they they are able to detain, arrest, put people on a plane and transport them halfway across the country very, very efficiently, and that they have absolutely, been unable to release people similarly. One of the things that's happening right now is, like, as I think was talked about during Judge Blackwell's order, right, was people being like the government would complain, well, you keep putting on these conditions on these release. Well, the judge orders like, well, you guys keep doing things that are completely like we never would expect, like releasing people out in the middle of the cold and -20-degree weather without any documents and in the middle of a park, right? Or deciding to release people that got transported to Texas but have no way to come back and without any documents, so they can't get on a plane, right? So the idea here is no, there is much more attention to being arresting and detaining people and transporting all of them around the world to releasing them, tracking them, and allowing people to talk with them. And that is clearly because they have, they have their budget is equivalent to the Israeli military budget. This one agency, Department of Homeland Security's budget, has the equivalent amount of money as the entire Israeli military.
Isn't
Right?
it more? I don't know where I read it, but isn't it more than all of our other law enforcement agencies combined?
Not even close. Like if you were talking about the FBI,
FBI,
ATF,
yep,
you're talking about all of
DEA,
And that's
yeah.
irregardless of a shutdown. The
yeah,
context of it doesn't that's the money that's already allocated,
that was in the big beautiful
cut
bill.
off and
Yep.
shut.
That money is there, and so they've got an incredible amount of money, and they have a lot of tech agent companies who are more than happy to do these giant tech contracts like Palantir and other corporations that are
What
more
about
than
the
happy to lend their
constitutionality of that? Can we go down that rabbit hole a little bit? Because we know they're using face scans, license plate scans. We've seen some of the people who have been observing or obstructing, depending on your politics, who say, suddenly an agent knows everything about me, shows up at my house, says, I know you. Is any of
Somebody
that?
lost their TSA pre-check.
yeah.
Yeah, is the technology getting ahead of the law?
So yeah, one of the things that I wanted to earlier when I was advocating for certain restrictions on data for a long time. And the reason why was because you would see immigration enforcement start to really rely upon data and information, right? And creating these databases. And it's not a surprise because that's exactly how large governments that want more and more control and want to be able to do things. And one of the things that I tried to point out to people is that you can't use data to track non-citizens without it tracking citizens.
Okay.
You can't have a database of immigrants and non-citizens that does not also contain citizens. Because what are you filtering? You have to take that information and filter it. Well, they're not throwing away the data. Like the fact that, let's assume for a second, my wife and I are both US citizens, but let's assume for a second that my wife is not a US citizen, right? If they wanted to track my wife, then they're going to track me.
Sure.
So when they want to track a person who works for another restaurant who is owned by a US citizen, guess what? The restaurant and the restaurant owner is getting tracked. So there is, when you create this giant data and this giant amount of information, that information, and this is tech companies continue to look at information as the resource that they will then mine, both for money and profit and for control, which is why governments love to work with these tech companies.
Yeah.
It is not a surprise that that is what they're doing. We now know, right, that there is a list that the Department of Justice, which is an organization that's supposed to be enforcing our criminal laws, is now keeping a list of people that they view believe that are protesting incorrectly. Now, they don't have enough, right now to start indicting and arresting people. But the question is, well, what are they using that list for? How is this not McCarthy red list or black list that people are doing? And yes, I think there are severe problems with this. I think what I don't think people understand is that it's really easy to think that immigration is, if I look around and I don't see any immigrants in my immediate circle, that I could think that it doesn't affect me. But it does affect you. It affects everything from your food, your housing, your healthcare, your everything about it, your communities. I mean, I think that's the reason why Minnesota and specifically the Twin Cities reacted the way they did, is because we do happen to have more and more neighbors that we can see the impacts and see it impacting us, right? It's not about us saving other people. It is about us wanting to preserve what we have, which we really do enjoy. I mean, that's the thing. I have a wonderful neighborhood. And the fact is that since December, when they came in to our city, that neighborhood has been affected, and it is, when I'm doing this work, it is of course easy to say, oh, I'm helping non-citizens. I'm a citizen. So does that mean I'm only doing it because I'm helping other people? No, I'm doing it because I believe in this idea of what a good, strong, healthy community is, and they're taking it away from it. So that this is the best thing that I can do.
So, Professor, obviously our immigration system has been broken for decades. Absolutely broken. I know, obviously, before the 2024 election, there was bipartisan agreement that looks like that they were going to obviously update our immigration laws. And our president told every Republican to kill it and not to do that. What do you think solutions are? Like, how could our immigration system work appropriately to be able to ensure that bad actors are not here, but folks who need to flee, refugees who might need to cross our border to protect their family, and they want to come here and work? What are fixes? What are solutions to try and fix our broken immigration system?
In light of what just happened too, if I can jump into,
Yeah.
because
Yeah, I think
the fix
those are
before is not the fix now, right?
Yeah, and I think this is a question that I think we need to ask our leaders, and we need to make clear to get what their vision of because I have talked in the past about the fact that being immigration law is, in every aspect of the word, defines what our country is. It is the most easiest example of what our country, if it's a country of values, what does that mean? Because it is the set of laws that decides who can be our neighbors, who can be our teachers, who can be the people that live with us. And it is a set of laws that decide when those people can no longer be in our community. Those are two giant questions that inform who we are as a country. Like, it is the absolute basis for deciding what our country is, right? You have on the one side J.D. Vance talking about this idea of heritage, that it is a country that is the people's right to be here needs to be, somehow, been an aspect of tradition and what people, where their ancestors came from, which of course I find
Well, mine came from
monstrous
France,
because,
Czechoslovakia,
yeah,
Croatia, Ireland.
exactly. And
Yeah,
of course
But a
ignores
lot of
the
these are
fact that the
majority
native,
ideas. Like,
that this,
Americans don't disagree broadly on a lot of these concepts.
yeah. And of course it disagrees with the founding fathers. It disagrees, which I always come back to, which is a wonderful speech made by Frederick Douglass. And he made this speech after, both before and after the passage of the 14th Amendment, which is he was arguing against the Chinese exclusion law. And the reason why he was arguing against it, because, and this is to answer your question and something I truly believe, it was called the Composite Nation speech. And what he was arguing is we need to come to terms with what we mean by equality. And in terms of our immigration system, that is what we need. We cannot have an immigration system that continues to exploit people, and it continues to give people less access to the rights that we enjoy. So here's what I would say. I
okay.
would say we need an immigration system that is not premised on a criminal system.
But
What
it
we
isn't, right? I mean, these are civil offenses currently. I
Well,
mean,
that is
so
what the idea of it is, but it is, in fact, as you can see, with ICE agents with police vests saying police, with the use of county jails and the use of detention facilities, and the ability of trying to call people criminals and rule breakers. That, yes, you're right, it is technically a civil system, and that has been declared to be so from the late 1800s, but that is not how it operates. If you were to ask someone sitting in an immigration detention cell whether or not they are being made to feel like they committed a crime, the answer is yes. They are put in jumpsuits. They are restricted from
Well,
who
we
they
didn't
can
change
call,
the law. We're changing how it's enforced without changing the law.
which is
or
why I think
interpret
a
it.
new system needs to recognize that. If we want this to be a civil system, if we want this to be a system in which we allow people a fair chance, that we actually say, hey, these are the rules, and if you follow them, we will give you a chance. Because what we're seeing now is that we gave the rules. Many of the people that are being deported, they followed the rules.
Yes.
We then told them with the new president that the president can take that out from under the rug. That can't be what the system is. So that's one. We need a system in which we have rules, not only rules that are clear, simple, but also rules that we can then reasonably expect that people can follow them, and that actually addresses our needs. The United States has benefited from immigration in so many ways, primarily through the use of labor and
Yeah.
primarily through that. We have to start recognizing what that actually means. And we can't.
Professor, have you looked at the Cato Institute's report? I read the summary just the other day. So obviously a pretty libertarian,
Yeah.
right-leaning organization, but just really talking about the trillions of dollars over the last, even I think it was like 30 years that it go back, um, in what they give to our economy, right? In paying in taxes and not being able to get benefits.
The
So
Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, within the
Yeah,
last
and
year, also released a study
there's a
predicting that. Yeah.
cartoon book actually written by a cartoonist named Zach Weinersmith and written by a very conservative libertarian, a law professor, basically called Open Borders, right? Saying that this is a situation in which, because if you care about our civil liberties and if you care about governmental overreach, the biggest threat to that is an immigration control system. There's just no, they control so many different aspects of us. For example, just to give one, uh, we now talk about the fact that people have work authorization or don't have work authorization.
Mhm.
That didn't come about until the 1980s. And it didn't come about for a long time because people thought about the ability and right to work as a fundamental right, right?
Sure.
If you talk to a lot of libertarians and a lot of people on the right, they would talk about the right to contract, the right to work. And I don't mean the right to work in the labor union sense, where it's
Sure.
actually not about working, it's about collective bargaining. But what I'm talking about is the actual ability to make a living. And
Mhm.
in the 1980s, we decided that non-citizens are the only group of people that actually have to ask for permission to work, right?
Okay.
That is a that is something that is an example of a restriction of civil liberties that if we allow that to still stay there, there's no reason why it can't extend, right, to citizens as well. And that's what we're seeing. Like, we're seeing an immigration system that is supposed to be exclusively for non-citizens or exclusively to people, non-citizens who don't follow the law. Well, now it's non-citizens who do follow the law. And now it's going to be a situation where it will impact citizens, right? We see the birthright citizenship case that's going to be challenged. They're talking about trying to take away naturalization and people's citizenship that they've already established. And of course, mixed status families. Like, there are many, many people whose children are citizens, whose husbands or wives are citizens, whose parents are citizens, and those families are going to be very impacted depending on what's going to happen over the next 3 years.
Yeah, Professor, I'm so glad you brought up children because that's the pivot I want to talk about because I feel like much of our conversation has been about adults. But I feel like one of the images and one of the things that's kind of captured the hearts and minds of the country are the kids. And, Liam in particular, the kid with the blue stocking hat who was eh, taken and returned. And now it sounds like his case is up in the air again, too. What about kids and what about the legal status and what we even know about, minors in a legal system and what we
Yeah.
can know and should know and what their status is? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. When I was actually starting to do this work was when Elian Gonzalez, if you guys
Oh,
remember
yeah,
Elian
Sure.
Cuban.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the
Cuban
first
kid who
kids
was
we knew
in
about.
he
Yeah. By
was in
name. And,
yeah, he was in immigration detention for a while. I used to, when I first started doing this work, I would go visit children who were in immigration detention, and my job as an attorney was to give them know your rights presentation.
Hmm.
Which, if you can imagine trying to talk to children, between the ages of 13, 14, all the way down to 5 or 6,
Oh
it's
my
difficult.
goodness.
I think the reason why children play such an important role, other than, of course, the faith aspects that a lot of people in America can see, is because it really makes clear the point that the issue of immigration can't be drawn with this idea of morality, meaning that these people broke the law or knew that they were breaking the law or whatnot. It also is a great example about why people choose to leave their homes. Most of the people that bring their children to the United States are doing so because they want to protect their children.
Mhm.
And we all
Absolutely.
understand that. And I think it's very, it's not too hard for anyone who's a parent to think about, would you choose your child or a border?
Mhm.
And why wouldn't you choose your child? In fact, wouldn't that you would be seen less than?
So, legally, do kids have different rights, special rights? How does the law look at them in immigration?
The children don't necessarily have different when it comes to deportation. There is a couple more potential legal avenues to prevent deportation, something called special immigrant juvenile status. But this administration has been basically, as an example, there are people who have applied for special immigrant juvenile status
Mhm.
who get what's called deferred action. So they get us something in the mail that says, we are not going to prioritize your removal because you have an application pending for special immigrant juvenile,
Mhm.
or even in situations where they get special immigrant juvenile status and this administration still detains and tries to deport them. And so there's been several habeases that have had to be filed on that basis. There are some specific legal protections about their use of detention, especially while they're a minor. So they are not supposed to be housed. But I will say that this administration is fighting that. That came about from the 1990s in a litigation settlement called the Flores settlement. And this administration, during the first Trump administration and this administration, they have explicitly tried to target and get rid of those protections. And those protections are as simple as not allowing children to be housed with adults, not allowing children to be housed in the same type of facilities that they're housing adults. Now, my preference is that even adults should not be housed in that way, right? Because they're being housed in prison conditions. But of course, children should not be. Now they have rules about children, like Liam was housed with his father, right? So
Mhm.
there are like family detention,
Mhm.
which is just a new sort of dystopian nightmare, right? Parents giving a choice between whether or not they need to be housed with their children in jail or not with their children in jail. Like what kind of like idea is that? And so yeah, that's the situation. And under the law, there are and you can see that there is a lot of pushback on this idea because they are afraid of what would that mean? Um, yeah.
Do we have 1 minute for solutions? Because that's or advice. That's one thing Tara and I are trying to do with our podcast is give people some hope, some ideas, some solutions. Do you have some take-home points before you have to go?
Yeah, we are actually in a very unique turning point. The Democrats have successfully managed to force some negotiation because of the budget aspect of it. They managed to have a situation where the DHS budget is going to be having a final passage. And in 2 weeks after the CR, the continuing resolution, is over, they have some ability to have some resolutions. Now, I personally look at the list that uh, Representative Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer have listed, and I say they're fine. It's a fine list, but the most important thing that's missing is how to hold the agency accountable. There is
Okay.
nothing in there that makes sure that the agency itself will actually do what it's required. You can give them a list of rules, but as we already know, there are already a list of rules. You don't need a list of rules to say that you're not supposed to shoot somebody. You don't need a list of rules to say that you're not supposed to detain
Yeah.
someone.
So what does accountability look like? Where does that happen? How does that happen?
And
Yeah.
that means, closing that loop, requiring legislation that will then allow people to be held accountable in civil rights litigation, requiring some form of accountability for what is going on. If agents on the ground feel as if they are immune or feel as if they are not going to be held accountable, then they will act with impunity. And if we want to be able to slow things down, if we want to be able to protect our civil rights and civil liberties, then we need to make sure that they respect them because they can be held accountable. So that's the thing that I would say. If it's not going to happen with the federal government, it can happen with the state. We have a legislative session coming up,
Yep.
and there are, in fact, several different bills that will try to do that, to try to hold that
That have to be
accountable.
bipartisan in our divided government. Minnesota.
Absolutely.
Yep.
But I think the message
Mhm.
should be to anyone, don't you want people who may violate your civil rights to be held accountable? Doesn't matter what
Mhm.
party. This shouldn't be a party situation.
It should not.
Yeah, and
It should
so
not.
I think that is the important thing, and that is something that is worth fighting for. And I think other things to really is, it sounds cheesy, but I think it is important, is to really do what we can to stay engaged with our community, to really, one of the powerful things that has come out of this, and it's not, it's one of those things where uh, I'm glad that people have found this strength. I am broken up that we have been forced to do it, but really, really looking at the idea that these are our communities, these are our neighbors, and these are the people that when we look around, their lives affect our lives. And that is something that is hopefully a lesson that can carry us forward, because we do have a lot of work to create a system that is better, fair, and absolute equality, in the words of Justice
And
of
has
Justice.
accountability.
Exactly,
Yeah.
accountability through government.
Well, lots
Professor
of
Li
great
yeah,
information.
Professor Chan, thank you so
Yeah.
much for doing this. Would really hope that, as this continues, that you'd be willing, to chat again at some point. Yeah,
It's
just
my
very
pleasure.
thankful for you
Yeah,
doing
really
this,
deep,
and
profound
thank you for all the work
information.
that you're
Thank
doing.
you.
Thank you very much, and have a good day, and have
You
a good
too.
weekend. Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.